But when you study at school mathematics, for example, you don't study how is it related to your own mind.
How it's related
The
to
theory
your own mind.
to the mind that created slash...
Yeah, but I don't think we need to study the
Observed it.
mind to study mathematics.
No, but
But
doesn't it tell something about the nature of the mind before it does on nature of reality?
You mean you have to understand the nature of the mind before you can understand the nature of reality? Is that
Of
the
nature.
question?
Yeah.
I mean,
Doesn't
see,
quantum physics, in a way, negate all physics as
No.
objective theory on
Well, I
or
think-
observations?
again, in quantum physics there are many interpretations and they don't agree. So there's many different interpretations of what quantum mechanics implies, but at least one of them or some of them would certainly negate that there is an independent objective world, whereas I think other interpretations don't necessarily negate that.
Okay.
Can I say something with respect to that and then ask my question?
Sure.
Having the capacity to observe the world and to apply principles to that world, even if that world is completely subjective, they still function. Like our mobile phones function. We have functionality. So
Sure.
it doesn't negate it,
No.
except that in the overall context, it might make it more complex.
Yeah, so, I mean, what we're saying here is that emptiness and functionality are actually two sides of a coin. They're not somehow contradictory.
Yeah.
Because normally for us, functionality seems to imply some objective, independent reality. And emptiness seems to be opposite to that.
Yeah.
But what we're saying is that the real understanding of emptiness is that emptiness means functionality. Functionality means emptiness. That's the correct view of emptiness.
So I struggle with the migration into the suffering realm.
Suffering
How
realm.
emptiness then leads into what causes suffering. So if somebody, let's use a standard example, if somebody pisses you off or does something that you would deem to be disrespectful or they hurt you or whatever it is, and you have an emotional reaction, how would using the view of emptiness shift that?
Yeah.
Or change it? Or
So the question is, how would a view of emptiness shift a suffering experience that we receive?
and particularly in the aversion realm, because in the pleasure
Yeah,
realm,
right.
it's sort of
So let's say someone's verbally abusing us. I mean, what's really happening, of course, is some sound waves are hitting the eardrum. That's it. No? I mean, that's all that's really... Objectively, that's all that's happening, isn't it?
If you're not there.
Isn't it? And so we are interpreting those sound waves in a certain way and reacting based on that, on the basis of grasping. And that's why we suffer. Because we believe that's not interpretation, that's really how it is. We don't understand that we're creating that world by interpreting it in a certain way. We don't realise that.
So if you follow that, then
If you
they
follow
might
that,
keep doing that, then
what it means is that if someone's verbally abusing you and you're sort of still in an empty, well, not in meditation, but that emptiness experience is still affecting you, what you will find is that instead of getting upset and angry at them, compassion will just spontaneously come up, because you'll see that that person is really messed up and they're creating so much suffering for themselves and the people around them. Because there won't be a target, see? There's no target. When we create a target, that's why we suffer. Because grasping means, here's a target. Fire at that and I'm going to suffer.
But you're using compassion in the strict Buddhist sense, not
No.
in the being nice to people and hugging them sense.
No, that's not compassion.
No, but I'm
Compassion is the wish for them to be free of suffering. So what would happen is there's no target. So those words, however hurtful they are, have no target. It's only if a target that we react. And that target is grasping. So if there's no target, we'll hear those words and then we'll see that this person is really mentally upset and disturbed. They're at least mentally suffering, and they're probably, a lot more suffering. So what will happen is, without intellectualizing, just spontaneously from that state of emptiness, this compassion will arise, this wish to help that person.
Where does wisdom come into that? Because if you
That is the wisdom. It's coming from wisdom.
But if you want to make sure that that behavior doesn't happen again, so if you think more globally, like if you're trying to change behavior, if you are sitting in compassion the whole time, how do you actually have behavior?
That compassion is in the nature of wisdom. See, we talk about we need to practice wisdom and compassion. And as a beginner, they are individual practices. But when we get to this point, it's one thing. There's not two separate things. Wisdom is manifesting as compassion. It's not like if we've got compassion, we've got no wisdom. The compassion is in the nature of wisdom.
So you're hearing it as sound waves. You're recognizing that they're suffering.
And so then, based on your wisdom of interdependency, you'll be able to much more easily see the big picture, not only the individual narrowed down, but you'll be able to pan out as well and see how can I best help this person deal with them immediately and in the longer term, the bigger picture, because that's the view we're going to have, is the big view.
Just to relate to that.
Okay. Well, actually, after this.
To look at them before us.
Yeah, but see, if we're coming out of emptiness, there is no them.
Okay.
There is no them and us.
Mm-hmm.
There's no target. It's just suffering is arising, and the automatic response is compassion, because there's no target. Yeah.
Can you please explain again from the 4 points, especially 3 and 4?
Sure. So there are many ways of doing emptiness practice, and in fact, in the session later this afternoon, this evening, we're going to do a different approach. Now we're doing this classic approach of looking for the me, but in some of the Tibetan traditions, particularly Mahamudra Dzogchen, generally that's not where they start. They look straight at the mind. So we're going to use that approach in the next session and in the evening session, called Nature of Mind Practice. So that's a very different approach. But here, this approach is classically used for investigating me, the person. First, of course, to get a clear picture of this, how this independent me that seems to be here exists, understanding where we need to look, and then here is the actual searching. So same means, is the me to be found anywhere within the body and the mind? So we search everywhere within the body and the mind, and we look for this me that seems to be here. That's here. So if we don't find the me anywhere in the body and the mind, then the me is not the same as the body and the mind. So the only other place it could be is something different than the body and the mind. And so in the meditation, I sort of express that in terms of, well, apart from the body and the mind, what else is there here? Because if the me is different than the body and the mind, we must be able to take away the body and the mind and be left with the me. But I think when you look here, you can only see body-mind. That's it. So then the me is not something different. And then we can rest in that experience of emptiness.
We begin in the 0 point.
0 point?
No, the 0 point in the emptiness.
What do you mean by 0 point?
0 point, it says that you go inside the emptiness.
I'm not sure I understand what you mean.
That you are inside, doing the meditation, you don't think about me or something else.
But if we're looking for the me, then we need to be looking at me.
No.
Otherwise we're not doing the practice.
It's gone.
Well, okay, yeah. Once you do the search,
Yeah, it's gone.
it's gone. Then you hold that experience. That's emptiness. You rest in that experience.
But how we get to the middle?
The middle.
The middle line.
That is the middle. That is the midpoint.
How we feed ourselves?
How do we...
We need to feed ourselves with things to next, or it's come along?
Oh, what's the next step?
Yeah.
That's the next topic, which I'm going to talk about very shortly. If we don't, we'll cover it in the next session. So, like every practice, we need to have a clear understanding of the steps we go through. How do we go further, deeper? what's next, what's next. So we have a direction for the practice, and that's the next presentation.
Regarding this practice, I found a very difficult way to overcome the intellectual way, because I find it boring, because I did it once, I know the answer, so what's the point in
That's right, because your intellectual mind thinks it knows the answer, so that's why we need to leave it out. That's why we need to switch it off, and what's going to be helpful there is shamatha practice. If we do more shamatha practice, you'll find that it's harder for the intellectual mind to come in and go, I know the answer, this is boring, let's forget it. So the more shamatha we have, the more you'll find that that won't happen. And the thing we need to remember is the answer is not in the intellectual mind. Because it's the intellectual mind that caused the problem. It's our discursive intellectual mind that created the grasping. So there is no answer in the intellectual mind. So that's another way we can let go of it. To understand we'll never find the answer in the intellectual mind, because it's the intellectual mind that created the problem. And as Einstein said, you cannot solve a problem at the level you created it. If we understand that, then also we can let go of more the intellectual mind. The intellectual mind is the thing that created the problem. We want to go beyond that, and we can only go beyond that by letting it have a holiday and just looking. Then we can, in direct experience, we can find the answer. And if we find the answer, or not find, but experience the answer in meditation, and we have that experience in meditation, and we come out of that practice, and someone says, tell me what you found. Your intellectual mind will go, it was sort of like space. It was sort of... You won't be able to use words, because this experience is beyond conception. You can't use conception to describe a non-conceptual experience. That's where the answer is. So if we keep the intellectual mind in there, we're blocking our chance of finding the truth. So give the intellectual mind a holiday.
How can you use some of these principles to help addiction?
Addiction. Oof. I mean, in some sense, Buddhism would say we're all addicted. You know, we're all dysfunctional. We all have ADHD. I mean, it's just a matter of degrees. You know, because often in our modern world we say, well, I'm okay because my mind is normal. But for Buddhism, a normal mind is very dysfunctional. It's still got attachment, jealousy, anger, anxiety. All of these things are in the normal mind. So we all have dysfunctional minds. But generally, then, that level of dysfunction is not so much that it stops us from getting into these practices. That we can, even with that level of dysfunction, we can start to get into these practices, to use those practices to overcome our craving, attachment, jealousy, so forth. But if we have very heavy level of mental afflictions, it's very difficult to get into these practices. And I think that's where a lot of work is being done in the last years, I think in the area of psychology, developing therapies to help people who have addiction issues, depression issues, you know, quite heavy problems, and particularly using mindfulness, but in a very tailored way to help them to bring them out of that heavy state to a level where then we can use a more standard approach to go further. Because in that state, it's quite difficult to do this sort of stuff, because it sort of assumes you have a minimum level of mental health to begin with.
So you wouldn't use anything around emptiness necessarily, at least not from a starting point?
No, because particularly, I mean, because if they've got these very heavy mental issues, they may completely misinterpret and it just make the situation worse. And so also, you know, if someone has very heavy things coming up, just using sort of bare mindfulness may even make it more exaggerated. So that's why with any practice you need a package, you need a framework. And so we're presenting the sort of the Buddhist framework. But I think if we want to use mindfulness in a mental health context, we need to sort of adjust that framework and make it more effective to support helping people with anxiety, depression, addiction issues and so forth. And I think that a lot of work is being done, certainly in the last 5 or 10 years, in these areas. So that's wonderful. Yeah, last question, then we take a break.
Some people that have gone through severe trauma,
Mm-hmm.
they claim to have the experience of no self.
Of no self.
Yeah, and I was wondering, maybe this is like a boost to them, a glimpse to emptiness. And there are some research about post-traumatic growth, that not with the resilience, not the quality of resilience, but there is something in those specific people that have gone through severe trauma with the post-traumatic effect, that are going to more spiritual ways,
Sure.
entering Buddhism.
Sure.
So maybe I was wondering if that is like a boost, a glimpse to that gate of emptiness of thank you trauma.
Yeah. I mean, yes, it can be. I mean, probably, you know, more often than not it doesn't happen. But yes, I think it can happen because, see, the thing is we are grasping onto this sort of sense of identity. And if we are confronted with something very, very strong, it can really crack that in like a very heavy negative way. It can really crack that. And often, of course, what happens, I think, is in those cases, it cracks it, but then we end up with sort of a no identity. It's not really a sort of emptiness, but we sort of get completely lost. But it can also, I think, have that effect of simply breaking our false sense of identity, and that could be a sort of a little bit of a taste of no self and emptiness. Yes, I think that's certainly possible. And I wanted to add something more now, but I've forgotten. It was in my mind, but it's gone now.
Eckhart Tolle talks about it.
Yeah. What was the other thing I wanted to add there? It's gone now. It's gone.
You need Shamatha.
No. It's gone. I was going to add something, but it's gone. No, it's gone. Maybe it'll come back in the next session.
Experiences of no self.
Yeah. No self. Yeah. No. It's gone now. Okay. Let's just leave it there. Take a break. Of course, yoga 3:45. We'll come back at 5 o'clock. And I want to then, in the next session, move into this other approach, or another approach, of investigating nature of reality in terms of the mind, this more nature of mind practice that we find in Mahamudra and Dzogchen. So we'll look at that, and then also we'll do some practice on that, and we'll also look at how to know we're progressing in this Vipassana practice. So that's next session. Let's take a break.